joined today by local historian Chris Daly to talk about the fabulous program we're having on the 100-year anniversary of the beginning of the Sacco Vanzetti episode. We're having it here on Tuesday evening, February 25th, starting at 7 o'clock. Chris, thanks for joining me today. It's so good to see you.
Thanks, Clayton.
So, I struggled with what to call it just now, the Sacco Vanzetti episode.
Yeah, it's usually called the Sacco Vanzetti case because it did
okay.
end up in the courts.
So how old were Sacco and Vanzetti when this all started 100 years ago?
Good. They were both in their early 30s.
Okay.
They were Italian immigrants and they were anarchists.
Anarchists.
Yes.
Living in Braintree?
No, Sacco lived in Stoughton
Okay.
and Vanzetti lived in Plymouth.
But they chose to rob the paymaster in South Braintree.
Now that's if they were guilty.
If they were, yes. Thank you for correcting me. I appreciate that.
The way I do the lecture, I give all the facts and I don't give my opinion on whether they did it or not. I let the audience look at the facts.
So they were convicted of a crime in South Braintree.
They were convicted in 27 they were sentenced, but they were convicted in 21.
But the actual alleged incident took place. There was an incident, I assume.
Yes, that took place April 15th, 1920, less than 5 miles from this location.
Wow.
Yeah.
So it definitely has local resonance.
Yes.
And it wasn't just a robbery.
No, it was the paymaster and his guard, Alessandro Baradelli, who was a Quincy resident, lived less than a mile from here. We're bringing down a payroll of $15,000 and 2 men.
That's a lot of money today.
Yeah.
Back then, that was a heck of a lot of money.
More. I don't know what it would be in 2020 money, but probably triple, if not quadruple.
Wow. And they were just carrying this on their person?
They were carrying that to pay off the help because they paid in cash back then. And these 2 men were just loitering around, jumped off a fence, and shot both of them and took the payroll, threw it in a getaway car. And
so 2 unknown people.
Yes, 2 men.
Jumped off of a fence, shot these guys,
right?
You're saying, and then took off with $15,000 in cash.
No, they weren't like on top of a fence. They were kind of just leaning against. It was a rail fence.
Okay.
In South Braintree, where the strip mall is down in Pearl Street.
Wow.
Yeah.
And it had to be witnessed by a whole bunch of people. So there were first-hand accounts of this?
There's first-hand accounts of it. Most of the people were working in the factory. Yeah. And people who did see these guys loitering outside thought, this is strange because everybody's at work. It was piecework. You didn't stand out you didn't go for a cigarette break back then. So people did notice them, and there were people that did look out the window. They could see it happening. Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure it made a fair amount of noise. Guns are not quiet today.
It did. Right. And there's a debate as to whether there was 1 gunman or 2 gunmen.
Okay.
My theory is I think there was only 1 gunman.
Okay.
Yeah.
And how long between when this incident happened and Sacco and Vanzetti were picked up?
They were picked up May 5th, 1920 in West Bridgewater.
So 20 days later?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
And
why did it take so long?
It all was because they were rounding up anarchists because there had been a spate of bombings.
Okay, locally?
Locally, all around the country.
Right.
This group that they belonged to, it came out later, they were sending mail bombs to prominent capitalists and judges and government officials. The irony of that is the only one to get killed in these bombings was a maid that opened up the package for her
Obviously
boss.
Not the intended target.
Right. They didn't think that maybe these millionaires don't open their own mail. Right. Yeah, so that's what happened. And most of the other ones were stopped, but it was traced to this group that they belonged to.
Mm-hmm. And what was the name of the group?
It was called Gruppo Autonomo was the name of it. That was Italian for the autonomous group. They all had regional ties to New York and Boston.
Right.
And the group was traced to here. And they started deporting all these people because most of them were foreigners, international anarchists,
as opposed to all the Native Americans that were in power at the time.
Yeah. And
But these were first-generation foreigners as opposed to the second or third or fourth generation.
No, it was right off the boat.
Oh, right off the boat.
Right,
okay.
right. That's why they could round them up and ship them out because they weren't U.S. citizens. But
there
was
no local attachment.
There was no trial or anything. They just picked you up and put you on a boat, sent you out just because you had socialist affiliation, communist or anarchist.
Wow.
It was called the Red Raids
Yeah.
of the 1920s. Yeah.
Okay. When I think of anarchists and bombings, I think wasn't it Haymarket in Chicago?
Yeah, that was in the 1880s.
Okay,
Yep.
so that was 40 years earlier.
Right, right. But
Similar, the
yeah.
same group of people, or totally
not
different
Well,
anarchists?
the same philosophy. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
And these guys that were part of Sacco Vanzetti's group thought the world of those anarchists,
Okay.
who they believed were wrongly convicted too. They didn't think that they actually threw the bomb,
Right.
that somebody else did. That's another whole debate.
Well, I know.
You know,
Yeah.
we
We're
won't
not
go down
talking about that today,
rabbit hole.
but when I think of bombings
Yeah.
and anarchists, that's the
Right.
most famous classic American
Right.
story.
So we've had these anarchists, going back to the 1800s. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so we were talking about the local residents. This happened in South Braintree.
Happened
they
in
were
South
picked up. You
Braintree.
said in? Did you say Stoughton?
West Bridgewater.
West Bridgewater.
Sacco lived
Okay.
in Stoughton.
Yeah.
Vanzetti lived in Plymouth. Baradelli, who was the guard, lived here in Quincy.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Parmenter, who was the paymaster, who was killed too, he lived over in Brockton.
Okay.
Yeah.
People even then commuted a long ways for these
They did.
jobs.
They had the trolley cars, the electric cars.
That's pretty. From Brockton, they were
All
coming on
over
a
the
trolley.
place. Yeah,
Wow.
you could go anywhere. Yeah.
That's pretty incredible. It's
And then
probably
the car
more.
came
It's
along
probably
and they tore
faster
up
than
all the
today.
tracks. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Wow, that's something to think about. And then, so I'm just trying to wrap my head around this. How did they get from? I just I don't know. I guess I should let go of the geography. They're just so spread out. I'm just kind of overwhelmed.
Yeah.
So these guys were picked up. They were kind of tried. They were definitely members of this anarchist group, whether or
Right.
not they were the individuals who committed this crime.
Right, but they
is-
weren't. That came into play, but they were picked up for the robbery. They weren't arrested as anarchists.
Okay. It was
But
just treated as a robbery, but
They
then
was
their
just treated
political
as an
affiliation.
everyday robbery,
Yep.
but then it was found out that they were anarchists. And
that was
I
used in
think
their
that
trial,
kind
or?
of oiled the wheels a little bit, yeah.
When did that become part of the story? Right
Almost
away? Or?
immediately.
Okay.
Yeah. The fella, there was Chief Stewart, who was chief over in Bridgewater, and he had some dealings with anarchists, and he was in on the investigation. When they found the getaway car from the robbery, he said, "These men knew no God." So when I saw that quote, I was like, he's talking about anarchists, because they were also atheists.
Atheists
they
as well.
were irreligious. They didn't believe in any religion.
And I know, some people today probably aren't aware of kind of the history of Italian Americans. It's not, whereas Italians have really become pretty greatly integrated into American
Yes, yeah,
society.
right.
I think at this time they were not.
No, not at all.
yeah.
They were, like, after the Irish, they were the next group to get slammed.
Right.
And it's like, America's this crucible where you have each group that comes in has to go through hell. And then before you know it, they're part of the establishment in the society,
Right.
Yeah. And the Italians went through it too, and the Jews and the Irish.
So how were Sacco and Vanzetti really active anarchists? Were they Italians that were being smeared because there were a bunch of anarchists from Italy?
Well, that's a good question,
Which
because
membership came first?
They claim they were philosophical anarchists, that they weren't part of the violent wing of their group.
Okay.
But they were associated with known violent anarchists.
Right.
So whether they were peaceful, peace-loving anarchists, they were associated with violent, terroristic anarchists that were involved in
Okay.
bombings. They called it propaganda of the deed. They believed if they started blowing things up, it would start a revolution, and that the capitalists would be defeated that way. And
Okay.
they were trying to touch off a revolution.
And in that way, we were talking before about how people confuse anarchists and communists and socialists.
Right.
But some of what you're talking about there sounds very similar to the rise of the working class and this
Right. Oh, they
communist,
were all for the
like,
working
workers'
class.
right.
Yeah, they believed in the working man. They believed that working men should work in collectives and have no bosses or government.
Yeah.
That there should be basically no law, that people, if you get rid of all the law and government and capitalists, that people will work together collectively, honestly.
Right.
I think it was a little naive, but...
Pretty utopian. Really.
Yes, very utopian. Yeah, they believed if you removed all the evil of government and money and all that stuff, that people would work together.
So these are like the folks who took over the national park out, or it wasn't a national park, the Western Lands a couple years ago out in
the
Washington
farmers?
State. The farmers who were
I don't know.
upset because
Yeah.
they had those same kind of, we got to just get government off of our backs.
Well, yeah, it's very close to what you call libertarians today.
But sure.
They're more radical than libertarians. Libertarians think basically that government here is to protect you from any outside invasion, and to protect you from yourselves, like the police, and that's it.
Yeah.
No schools, no programs. You're on your own, but you have absolute freedom. They look at the freedom. And the anarchists were like that too a great deal, but they had great sympathy for the working man, and they were totally against capitalist corporations.
Right, which is not shared by some of the libertarians.
Right. I think some of the libertarians, it depends.
Depends on who
There's
you're
a
talking
whole
to. You
gradient
can't,
there.
yeah, of course.
I guess Ron Paul would be your people to ask about that.
So why do you think it resonates such 100 years later? What is it about this case that people should be intrigued and find out more?
Well, to me, it's like, were they guilty?
Yeah.
And people right off the bat will say, oh, they were railroaded.
I think it's fascinating. I know that their ashes are actually in the back stacks at Boston Public Library because I don't think anybody wanted to be responsible for them.
Nobody.
There's still
There's also a plaque there too that they haven't.
I have seen
in
that
the
plaque.
library. There's a group that wants to put it out on Hanover Street where their defense committee used to meet. But I think the original question.
Well, why does it resonate so? Why is it still? I mean, why is the plaque still up in the local history?
Right,
hidden instead of out on Hanover
Well,
Street?
it's there's the people that believe that they were railroaded. It was the establishment society that railroaded them. And myself, I think it's kind of a mystery. There's a lot missing here. If you look at the trial, they were basically convicted because one bullet that came out of Baradelli, matched Sacco's gun.
One bullet.
One bullet.
With absolute certainty. Yeah.
Right. And the thing is, and this is where it goes a little haywire, if you look at all the eyewitness accounts, there were two men, but one guy was doing all the shooting. Did he switch guns? So that lends me to think, maybe there was some shenanigans going on, because back then they didn't keep the evidence in tight regulation. They didn't keep it recorded. Who would look at it? The guy who was doing the ballistics was walking around with the bullets in his pocket at his house. And, so it was quite easy to take the gun and probably fire it.
Put any bullet you wanted in there.
But the jury that heard that evidence took it for what they thought, this bullet came from his gun. It wasn't because, we ate Italians. And then, it comes out later that years later, like within the last 20 years, that there's some indication that there was a bullet switch.
Interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I'm sure there are many other fascinating aspects to this as well. There's a reason this story has lasted. So I'm really glad that you're going to come to the library and tell some of this story and help us remember this time. There's obviously a lot to think about, from the transportation to the class warfare, which continues today.
Right.
Although hopefully with different means. I haven't heard of bombs going through the mail recently, which I'm grateful for.
Oh, yeah. That's not good. Yeah.
No, not at all.
And it all happened around here.
And it's all very, very local.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, welcome back to Quincy.
Thank you.
I'm so glad to have you back, Chris. Thank you.
Thank you.
Please come out and join us and learn lots more about Sacco and Vanzetti when we'll be talking about them and this fascinating element of historic New England here at the library on Tuesday, February 25th, starting at 7 o'clock. I look forward to seeing you there.